The rhythmic hum of the elevator was a familiar sound to Noah Blackwell, yet it never failed to remind him of the life he had built, or inherited. As the doors opened with a soft chime, the sprawling view of Manhattan unfurled before him. The Blackwell Tower, a sleek monument of steel and glass, stood as a testament to his family's legacy. Below, the city glittered, a mosaic of ambition, power, and dreams. It was breathtaking, but Noah could feel its weight pressing against the walls of his chest. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwell." The doorman, immaculately dressed in black, offered him a polite nod as he stepped into the penthouse. "Evening, James," Noah replied with a faint smile that barely reached his eyes. The silence of the apartment greeted him like an old friend, its vast, meticulously curated spaces echoing with a quiet emptiness. Everything was perfect here, too perfect. Marble countertops gleamed under soft, recessed lighting. A crystal decanter sat on a tray, untouched. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Noah slipped off his jacket and loosened his tie, letting it hang loosely around his neck. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the living room, gazing out at the city. It was alive with energy, yet he felt a million miles away. It always felt like this, a city of opportunities and connections, yet somehow lonelier than the quietest countryside. He picked up his phone from the glass coffee table. 2 new messages from his father. "Jonathan Blackwell. Meeting went well. Harringtons are ready to finalize the merger. You'll announce the engagement next month." Noah's jaw tightened as he read the texts. It wasn't a question, it never was. His father's words carried the authority of a decree, the kind that could shape companies and crush dissent. Jonathan Blackwell hadn't built an empire by taking no for an answer. The idea of marrying Sophia Harrington, a socialite with a designer smile and a personality that mirrored the champagne she loved, bubbly but ultimately hollow, made Noah's stomach churn. It wasn't that she was a bad person. On paper, she was perfect, poised, beautiful, well-connected. But on the rare occasions they'd met, her laughter rang hollow, like the echo of a life performed for others. She didn't love him, and he didn't love her. For his father, though, love was irrelevant. The merger was all that mattered. Noah poured himself a glass of scotch and let the liquid burn its way down his throat. His reflection in the window stared back at him, the carefully crafted image of success. The tailored suit, the sharp jawline, the meticulously groomed dark hair. It was all a facade. Beneath it, Noah was as fractured as the cityscape refracted in the glass. He thought of his mother, her laughter warm and unrestrained, a sharp contrast to the sterile world his father inhabited. She had been the one who told him stories of love that defied odds, who taught him to look beyond wealth and appearances. Her voice, now only a memory, whispered through his mind, "True happiness isn't found in what you own, Noah. It's found in who you share it with." But what did she know? She had married a man who loved power more than he ever loved her. Noah drained the rest of his drink and grabbed his coat. He couldn't stay here, surrounded by the silence and the suffocating expectations. The city outside called to him, a chaotic, unpredictable symphony that might drown out the noise in his head. The chill of the February night greeted him as he stepped out onto the street. The sharp wind bit at his face, but he welcomed it. It made him feel alive in a way the stifling comfort of his penthouse never could. Noah wandered aimlessly through the streets, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his overcoat. As he walked, he passed restaurants filled with laughter, their windows fogged with warmth and life. He passed couples holding hands, their steps in sync as though they'd been walking together for decades. And then he passed a park, its skeletal trees casting jagged shadows under the streetlights. It was quieter here, almost peaceful. He was about to keep walking when he noticed a figure huddled on a bench, wrapped in a mismatched collection of blankets and plastic. Her auburn hair caught the light, and even from a distance Noah could see the defiance in the way she sat, her back straight despite the cold. She noticed him too, her sharp green eyes locking onto his. "Are you just going to stand there staring?" she called out, her voice steady and edged with sarcasm. "Or do you have some grand Wall Street wisdom to share?" Noah blinked, caught off guard. "I wasn't staring," he said, though he clearly had been. "And no wisdom tonight." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Pity. I could use a stock tip." Despite himself, Noah felt a smile tugging at his lips. "Coffee, then?" he offered, gesturing to the cafe across the street. "My treat." The woman studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the pros and cons of engaging with a stranger. Then she shrugged. "Sure. Why not?" As they crossed the street, Noah couldn't help but wonder why he felt so drawn to her. She didn't fit into his world, and yet, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't walking through it alone. The night, it seemed, had more to offer than cold winds and empty streets. The warmth of the cafe was a sharp contrast to the biting chill outside. Noah held the door open, stepping aside to let the woman enter first. She shot him a glance, half curiosity, half suspicion, before walking in. Her patched coat and scuffed boots seemed out of place among the polished marble floors and gleaming brass fixtures, but she carried herself with an unshakable air of self-possession. As she moved toward a table by the window, Noah ordered 2 coffees at the counter, black. When he returned, she was peeling off her gloves, her fingers red from the cold. "Thought you might appreciate something warm," Noah said, setting 1 cup in front of her. She wrapped her hands around the cup but didn't drink immediately. "Thanks. I guess you're one of those rare breeds who doesn't just keep walking when they see someone like me." Noah took the seat across from her, leaning back. "And you're one of those rare breeds who doesn't pretend everything's fine when it's clearly not." Her lips curved slightly, the closest thing to a smile he'd seen from her so far. "Fair enough. But I'm not in the mood for a pity party, so if that's your angle—" "It's not." Noah cut her off gently. "Sometimes it's just easier to talk to someone who doesn't already think they know your whole story." She raised an eyebrow, her green eyes narrowing. "You think you know my story?" "No," he said, meeting her gaze. "And I'm not going to guess. But if you want to tell me, I'm listening." She hesitated, then took a cautious sip of her coffee, her expression softening as the heat worked its way through her. "What's your name?" she asked abruptly. "Noah. Noah Blackwell." Her eyebrows twitched upward and she tilted her head slightly. "Blackwell? As in Blackwell Tower? The fancy tech company?" He nodded, already anticipating the judgment or assumptions that usually followed. Instead, she shrugged and said, "Figures. You've got that important meetings and overpriced suits vibe." Noah laughed, the sound startling even to himself. "And you've got that calls out BS before it even lands vibe." This time she did smile just a little. "It's Lila Rose." "Lila Rose," he repeated as though tasting the name. "Nice to meet you." "Is it?" she asked, her tone teasing but edged with a challenge. "What exactly are you expecting to get out of this, Noah Blackwell? Some karmic brownie points? A good story to tell your friends?" Noah shook his head, his amusement fading. "No expectations. Just, I saw you and you looked like you didn't want to be alone tonight." "Neither did I." Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. Surprise, maybe, or skepticism. She took another sip of coffee, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "So what's your story? I bet it's a real tearjerker." Lonely billionaire looking for meaning in a world full of shiny things. Close, Noah said, not missing the sarcasm in her voice. Except it's more like lonely billionaire trying to dodge an arranged marriage. Lila choked on her coffee, setting the cup down quickly. I'm sorry, what? You heard me, Noah said, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. My father thinks marrying the daughter of his business partner is the key to cementing his legacy. I think it's the key to losing my sanity. Lila stared at him, then shook her head in disbelief. And here I thought my life was a mess. You've got your own soap opera. You have no idea. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Lila traced the rim of her coffee cup with a finger, her expression thoughtful. Why don't you just say no? It's not that simple, Noah said, his voice quieter now. Everything I've built, everything I've worked for, is tied to him. Saying no would mean walking away from all of it. Lila looked at him sharply. And? Isn't that the price of freedom? Noah opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss. The simplicity of her question hit him harder than it should have. He'd been so entrenched in his world of deals and contracts that he'd forgotten there were people who valued freedom more than comfort, even if it came at a cost. What about you? He asked, deflecting. Why are you here, Lila Rose? What's your story? Her gaze turned guarded again, the walls going back up. Let's just say I've been on the wrong side of luck for a while. Life threw a few curveballs and I struck out. That's vague. Intentionally, she said, her voice cool but not unkind. You're not the only one with complicated strings attached. Noah didn't push. He knew what it was like to keep parts of yourself hidden, even from people who seemed willing to understand. Instead, he leaned back, letting the silence linger. Outside, snow began to fall, soft flakes drifting through the glow of the streetlights. Finally, Lila stood, slipping her gloves back on. Thanks for the coffee, Noah Blackwell, but you don't owe me anything and I'm not looking to be anyone's project. You're not a project, he said firmly, standing as well. But if you ever need a break from the cold, I'll be around. Lila looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, pulling her coat tighter around herself. Good night, Noah. He watched her walk out into the snow, her figure disappearing into the swirling white. For a moment he considered following her, but something told him she needed the space. As he stepped back out into the night, his own words echoed in his mind. Saying no would mean walking away from all of it. Maybe Lila was right. Maybe freedom was worth the price. For the first time in years, Noah felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Hope. The snowstorm had quieted by the time Noah arrived back at the penthouse. The city below was still alive, its muted hum a stark contrast to the whirl of thoughts in his mind. Lila Rose. Her name stuck with him, as did her fierce green eyes and the way she challenged him without hesitation. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, a woman who had nothing to lose, yet carried herself with more dignity than most of the high society elites in his world. He loosened his tie and tossed his coat over a chair, sinking onto the sofa with a sigh. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at the screen. Jonathan Blackwell. We need to finalize the engagement announcement. Sophia is expecting your call. You're running out of time, Noah. Noah clenched his jaw and tossed the phone back onto the table. The pressure was relentless, a constant reminder that his life was a chessboard, and his father was the one moving the pieces. But tonight, he couldn't stop thinking about what Lila had said. Isn't that the price of freedom? Freedom. It sounded so simple when she said it. But for him, walking away from Blackwell Enterprises wasn't just about losing his job. It meant abandoning everything his mother had believed in, everything he'd worked to build. His stomach twisted at the thought. The next evening, Noah found himself in a different part of the city, far from the penthouses and private clubs he was used to. He wasn't sure what had drawn him back to the park where he'd first met Lila. Maybe it was the need for clarity or the faint hope that she might be there. As he rounded the corner, he spotted her sitting on the same bench, bundled in her tattered coat and sketching in a battered notebook. The sight of her grounded him, her focus unbroken despite the cold. "Hey," he called out softly as he approached. Lila glanced up, her expression shifting from surprise to guarded curiosity. "You again." She set her pencil down, tilting her head. "What brings Mr. Blackwell back to the trenches?" "Couldn't stay away," he said with a faint smile, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "I owe you another coffee." She raised an eyebrow. "Do you now?" "Think of it as a thank you. You said something the other night that's been stuck in my head." Lila leaned back against the bench, folding her arms. "What? That freedom has a price?" "Exactly," Noah said, taking the seat beside her. "I've been thinking about that a lot, about what I'm willing to give up for it." She studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face as though trying to decide if he was serious. "And what's the verdict?" Noah hesitated, the words heavy on his tongue. "I can't let my father dictate my life anymore. But walking away means losing everything I've ever known." "Then maybe you don't need to walk away," Lila said, her tone softer than he expected. "Maybe you just need to change the rules of the game." He blinked, startled by the simplicity of her suggestion. Change the rules? It was something he'd never considered. In his world, the rules were unyielding, set in stone by men like his father. But maybe, just maybe, Lila was right. They talked for hours as the city's lights twinkled around them. Lila told him more about her sketches and how art had once been her escape, a dream she'd abandoned when her world fell apart. Noah listened, genuinely interested in every word. For the first time in years, he felt like he was having a real conversation, one unburdened by hidden agendas or polite facades. Lila's honesty was refreshing, and her quiet strength made him wonder how she had survived so much without losing herself. But as the night wore on, an idea began to take shape in his mind, one so outrageous that it made his heart race. "Lila," Noah said finally, his voice steady despite the storm of nerves in his chest, "what if I told you there was a way for both of us to change our lives?" She frowned, her pencil hovering over her notebook. "What do you mean?" "What if you didn't have to stay out here fighting for every scrap? What if you had a real chance to start over?" Lila's eyes narrowed, her guard going back up. "What are you talking about, Noah?" "I'm talking about a deal," he said, leaning closer. "A way to get my father off my back and give you a fresh start." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You're not serious." "I am," Noah said. "If I tell my father I'm marrying someone else, someone who has nothing to do with his plans, it'll throw a wrench in everything he's been trying to force on me. And for you, it means a roof over your head, financial stability, whatever you need to get back on your feet." Lila shook her head, letting out a disbelieving laugh. "You want me to marry you? Are you insane?" "Not for real," Noah clarified quickly. "Just on paper, long enough to make my father back off. After that, you'd be free to walk away, no strings attached." She stood, crossing her arms as she looked down at him. "You can't be serious." "I am," he said, rising to meet her gaze. "And I know how it sounds, but think about it. What do you have to lose?" Lila's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she looked like she was considering it. But then she shook her head again, her voice firm. "I don't need your charity, Noah. I've gotten this far on my own, and I'm not about to trade my freedom for some twisted game you're playing with your dad." "It's not charity," Noah said quietly. It's a choice. And if you say no, I won't bring it up again." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them thick as the cold night air. Finally, Lila sighed and picked up her bag. "I'll think about it." "That's all I'm asking," Noah said, his voice soft. "Just think about it." As she walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the city, Noah felt a pang of uncertainty. He'd taken a gamble by making his proposal, and now he could only hope she'd be willing to take a chance on him, too. The days that followed felt like a haze to Noah, a slow crawl of tension and doubt. He threw himself into work, his usual escape, but even the towering deadlines and high-stakes meetings failed to distract him. The silence on Lila's end gnawed at him. He hadn't expected an immediate answer, but the not knowing weighed heavily. Every so often his phone would buzz, and he'd glance at it, only to see messages from his father or colleagues. No word from Lila. By the third day, he began to wonder if he'd made a mistake. Maybe he'd misread her entirely. Maybe she thought he was just another arrogant, out-of-touch millionaire trying to solve his problems with money. Still, a part of him clung to the hope that she was considering it. After all, she hadn't outright refused. On the fourth evening, Noah sat in the penthouse living room, nursing a glass of wine and staring out at the glittering Manhattan skyline. The sound of the elevator made him sit up, his pulse quickening. Few people had access to his private floor, and he wasn't expecting anyone. When the doors opened, Lila stepped out. She was still bundled in her patched coat, her auburn hair wild from the wind. The look on her face was a mix of determination and apprehension. Her hands were shoved deep in her pockets, as if she were bracing herself for what was to come. Noah stood, setting his glass aside. "Lila." "I had to see it for myself," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her posture. She glanced around the room, taking in the sleek furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the artwork on the walls. "Your world." "It's not as perfect as it looks," Noah said quietly. She met his gaze, her green eyes sharp. "It never is." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their last conversation hung between them, unspoken but palpable. Finally, Lila took a step forward. "I've thought about what you said," she began, "and I still think it's crazy, but—" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "I've had my fair share of crazy, and sometimes it's the only thing that works." Noah's chest tightened. "Does that mean you'll do it?" "It means I'm willing to talk terms," Lila said, her tone measured. "If we're going to do this, I need to know exactly what I'm getting into." They sat at the dining table, the city lights casting a soft glow over the room. Noah explained everything: his father's expectations, the pressure to marry Sophia, and the freedom this arrangement could give both of them. Lila listened intently, her expression unreadable. "And what happens when your father finds out it's not real?" she asked. "He won't," Noah said. "Not if we do this right. He's more focused on the optics than the reality. As long as it looks convincing, he won't dig too deep." Lila raised an eyebrow. "You sound awfully sure of that." "I know how he operates," Noah said, leaning forward. "He's not interested in the details, just the results. If we can sell this, he'll back off." She tapped her fingers against the edge of the table, her gaze thoughtful. "And what happens to me when this is over?" Noah hesitated. "You'll have whatever you need to move forward, a place to stay, financial support." "That's not what I meant," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "What happens to my life when people start asking questions? When the media starts digging? I've worked hard to disappear, Noah. I don't want to lose that." Her words hit him harder than he'd expected. He hadn't considered the cost to her beyond the immediate arrangement. "You won't lose it," he said. "We'll keep things as private as possible, and if anyone does start digging, I'll handle it." Lila studied him. her green eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it." Noah released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You won't regret this, Lila." She snorted softly. "That remains to be seen." The next morning, Lila officially moved into the penthouse. Noah had arranged for a wardrobe to be delivered, along with everything else she might need to fit the role of his fiancée. When she stepped out of her room in one of the new outfits, a simple but elegant black dress, Noah couldn't help but stare. "What?" she asked, frowning at him. "You look incredible," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Lila rolled her eyes, but a faint blush crept into her cheeks. "Don't get used to it." Elena, Noah's assistant, arrived soon after to help Lila prepare for their first public appearance. She greeted Lila with a warm smile and a firm handshake. "It's nice to finally meet you. Noah's told me a lot about you." "Has he?" Lila said, her tone skeptical but curious. "Only good things," Elena assured her. She handed Lila a folder filled with information on the event they'd be attending that evening, a charity gala hosted by one of Blackwell Enterprises' biggest clients. "This is your first official outing as Noah's fiancée. Let's make it count." Lila glanced at the folder, then back at Noah. "So this is what I've signed up for? Fancy dresses and small talk with rich strangers?" "Pretty much," Noah said with a faint smile. "But you'll be fine. Just be yourself." She arched an eyebrow. "Somehow, I don't think myself is what these people are expecting." "Then surprise them," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You're more than they deserve, Lila. Don't forget that." For a moment she looked at him, her usual defenses wavering. Then she nodded, her expression hardening once more. "Let's get this over with." As they prepared to step into the spotlight, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that their arrangement was about to change both of their lives in ways neither of them could predict. The sleek black car pulled to a stop in front of the Grand Hotel. Its towering facade was aglow with lights, the windows casting warm golden hues into the crisp night air. Lila stared out the window, her stomach churning as elegantly dressed guests streamed up the marble steps into the building. "Remind me again why I agreed to this," she muttered, adjusting the hem of the emerald green gown Elena had selected for her. The fabric shimmered with every move, clinging just enough to highlight her figure. It was beautiful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was wearing someone else's life. "Because," Noah said, his tone calm but firm, "it's the first step in convincing everyone this is real, and because you look stunning, even if you refuse to admit it." Lila shot him a look, her lips quirking upward despite herself. "Flattery isn't going to save you if this turns into a disaster." Noah smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "It won't. Just stay close, and remember, you don't owe these people anything." Before Lila could respond, the driver opened her door, and the cool evening air rushed in. Noah stepped out first, extending a hand to help her. For a moment she hesitated. The cameras lining the entrance flashed incessantly, and the murmur of voices was a steady hum. It felt like a stage, and she was the unwilling star of a performance she hadn't rehearsed for. But then Noah's hand steadied her, his gaze reassuring. Taking a deep breath, Lila stepped out into the spotlight. The ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting soft light over the sea of tuxedos and gowns. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played in the corner, their music weaving through the gentle hum of conversation. Lila felt the weight of the room's attention almost immediately. Heads turned, eyes lingered, and whispers followed in their wake as Noah led her through the crowd, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "Relax," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "You're doing great." She wasn't so sure about that. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to keep her head high and her steps steady. She caught snippets of conversation, murmurs about her dress, her presence, the audacity of Noah bringing someone so unfamiliar into their carefully curated circle. They stopped near a small group of men, all middle-aged and exuding the confidence of wealth and influence. Noah introduced her, his tone smooth and composed, but she could see the faint tension in his shoulders. These men were powerful players in his world, and their approval, or lack thereof, carried weight. "Lila Rose," one of them said, his voice rich with curiosity as he took her hand. "You're quite a surprise." Lila gave him a polite smile, resisting the urge to pull away. "I've been told I'm full of them." The men chuckled, though she could feel their eyes assessing her, searching for cracks in the facade. But Noah didn't waver, his steady presence a silent reassurance. As the evening wore on, Lila began to notice the subtle dance of power that played out around her. Conversations were layered with hidden meanings, every word carefully chosen to convey strength or vulnerability without giving too much away. It was a language she didn't speak, but she was learning to read its cues. It wasn't long before they encountered Sophia Harrington. She was as poised and polished as Lila had imagined, tall, blonde, and dressed in a gown that seemed designed to make everyone else feel underdressed. Her blue eyes swept over Lila, her smile cool and calculated. "Noah," Sophia said, her tone smooth as silk. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight, and with such intriguing company." Lila felt the barb beneath the words, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she smiled sweetly. "I'm sure it's hard to keep track of Noah's schedule. He's been quite busy lately." Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly, but her smile didn't falter. "I suppose that explains it. You're Lila, was it?" "That's right," Lila said, keeping her tone light. "And you must be Sophia. Noah's mentioned you." "Has he?" Sophia's gaze flicked to Noah, who had remained silent, watching the exchange with a faint smirk. "I do hope he mentioned all the good things." "Of course," Lila said, her smile widening. "But you know Noah. He's a man of few words." Sophia's expression tightened, but before she could respond, Noah stepped in. "Sophia, always a pleasure," he said smoothly, his hand settling on Lila's waist. "But if you'll excuse us, I promised Lila a dance." Without waiting for a reply, he guided Lila onto the dance floor, his touch firm and reassuring. The quartet had begun a slow waltz, and as Noah placed one hand on her waist and took her other in his, Lila couldn't help but laugh softly. "A dance?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "Really?" "You were holding your own," Noah said, his tone low and amused, "but I figured you could use a break." They moved together in time with the music, the world around them fading slightly as they fell into an easy rhythm. For the first time that night, Lila felt the tension in her chest begin to ease. "You didn't have to save me," she said quietly. "I can handle people like her." "I know," Noah said, his gaze steady, "but you don't have to do it alone." The words settled between them, heavier than the moment warranted. Lila looked up at him, the distance between their worlds suddenly feeling smaller. For all his wealth and power, Noah seemed as much an outsider in this world as she was. The song ended too soon, and as they stepped off the dance floor, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She wasn't sure what it was, but for the first time in a long while she felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting, and maybe even winning. The car ride back to the penthouse was quiet. Lila stared out the window at the city rushing past, the rhythmic sound of tires on pavement blending with the faint hum of the radio. She could still feel the weight of the evening, The scrutinizing eyes, the calculated smiles, and most of all, Sophia Harrington's barely veiled hostility. The tension in her shoulders hadn't eased, even as the glitz and glamour faded behind her. Noah broke the silence. "You were incredible tonight." Lila turned to him, surprised. "Incredible? I think Sophia might disagree." His lips curved into a small smile, but his eyes held something softer. "Sophia thrives on control. You shook her confidence. That's more than most people manage." "I wasn't trying to shake her confidence," Lila muttered, crossing her arms. "I was just trying to survive." "And you did more than that," Noah said, his voice calm and steady. "You proved you could handle yourself in a room full of people who would love to see you fail. That's no small thing." Lila let his words settle, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to believe him, to feel proud of the way she'd held her own. But another part, the one that had grown used to fighting for survival, couldn't shake the nagging doubt. When they arrived back at the penthouse, Lila kicked off her heels with a groan and collapsed onto the sofa. She felt the weight of the night pressing down on her like a lead blanket. Noah disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with 2 glasses of wine. He handed her one without a word, settling into the chair across from her. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the city lights filtering through the massive windows. Lila sipped her wine, the rich flavor grounding her in the moment. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Tired of what?" Noah asked, leaning back in his chair. "All of it," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the windows. "The parties, the expectations, the constant need to prove yourself." Noah studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "More than you know," he admitted finally. "But it's the world I was born into. Walking away isn't as easy as it sounds." Lila nodded, her gaze dropping to her glass. "I get that. Believe me, I do. But tonight made me realize how much of this world is built on appearances. Everyone's pretending. I just don't know if I'm cut out for that." "You're not pretending, though," Noah said, his voice firm. "That's what makes you different. And whether they admit it or not, people notice." She looked up at him, surprised by the intensity in his tone. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the distance between their lives seemed to shrink. The next day, Lila found herself wandering the penthouse, trying to shake the restlessness that had settled over her. Noah was in his office, dealing with calls and meetings, and she didn't want to interrupt. She ended up in the kitchen, rummaging through cabinets until she found a notebook and a set of pencils tucked away in a drawer. She hadn't drawn in months, not seriously anyway. The weight of survival had left little room for creativity. But now, with the luxurious quiet of the penthouse wrapping around her, she felt a strange urge to let her thoughts spill out onto the page. She sat at the kitchen counter and began sketching, her hand moving instinctively over the paper. At first, the lines were hesitant, but soon they flowed with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. The image began to take shape, a pair of hands, worn but steady, reaching for each other across an unseen divide. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear Noah come in. "That's incredible," he said, his voice startling her. Lila jumped, her pencil slipping from her fingers. She turned to see Noah leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed and a small smile playing on his lips. "It's just a sketch," she said quickly, closing the notebook as if to hide it. "It's more than that," he said, walking over to her. "You've got real talent, Lila." She shook her head, brushing off the compliment. "It's just something I used to do. It's not important." "It is," Noah insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "You shouldn't hide it." Lila hesitated, her fingers brushing over the edge of the notebook. She hadn't shared her art with anyone in years, not since her life had fallen apart. But there was something in Noah's tone, something sincere that made her want to believe him. Later that evening, Noah found himself pacing in his office, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. He couldn't deny the growing respect he felt for Lila. She was strong in a way that most people he knew weren't, unafraid to challenge the world around her. And yet, there was a vulnerability to her, a rawness that made her seem more human than anyone he'd ever met. But with that admiration came a new sense of responsibility. This arrangement had started as a calculated move to outmaneuver his father, but now it was becoming something more. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a dangerous line, one where the stakes were higher than he'd anticipated. As he stared out at the city, the words of his mother came back to him. True happiness isn't about what you can control, Noah. It's about the people you let in. For years he'd kept his walls high, letting no one close enough to see the cracks. But Lila was different. She didn't push or pry, yet somehow she was breaking through. And that terrified him as much as it intrigued him, because letting someone in meant risking everything. Noah adjusted his tie in the mirror, his jaw tightening as he prepared for another day of navigating the endless currents of high-stakes business. He had grown used to the rituals of his life, polished appearances, calculated words, and the constant maneuvering required to stay ahead. But this morning felt different. A gnawing unease had settled in his chest, one he couldn't quite explain. It had been 2 weeks since Lila had moved in, and though their arrangement was still a fragile performance, Noah found himself thinking about her more often than he cared to admit. She was an enigma, bold, sarcastic, and unafraid to challenge him, yet there was a quiet strength beneath her guarded exterior that fascinated him. He glanced toward the kitchen, where the faint sound of music drifted through the open door. Lila had developed a habit of listening to old jazz records while she sketched, her focus unwavering as the music filled the space. He found himself lingering in the doorway more often than he should, watching her lost in her work, unaware of the way she transformed the sterile penthouse into something warmer, more alive. In the kitchen, Lila was hunched over the counter, her pencil flying across the page of her notebook. She had spent the morning sketching the city skyline, trying to capture the way the light played off the glass towers. Her fingers were smudged with graphite, and she didn't notice Noah standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. "Good morning," he said, stepping into the room. Lila looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Morning, you're up early." "Big day," Noah said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "What about you? Working on something new?" She shrugged, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Just messing around, nothing special." "Everything you've shown me so far has been special," Noah said, his tone sincere. "You should give yourself more credit." Lila rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her lips. "You're too good at this, you know, the whole smooth-talking thing." "It's not smooth-talking if it's the truth," Noah said with a grin. "Anyway, I wanted to ask if you're up for another event tonight. My father's hosting a fundraiser, and he'll expect us to make an appearance." Lila groaned, setting her pencil down. "Another party? How many of these do you people have?" "It's not optional," Noah said, though there was a hint of apology in his voice. "But you'll handle it just like you did last time. Better even." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Fine. But you owe me more than a glass of wine after this one." "Deal," Noah said, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. The fundraiser was being held at a sprawling estate just outside the city, a gleaming symbol of wealth and excess. Lila felt a familiar knot of tension form in her stomach as they arrived, her hands tightening around the clutch she carried. She could already hear the murmur of voices and the clinking of glasses as they stepped out of the car. "Just remember," Noah said quietly as they approached the entrance, You're not alone in this." She glanced up at him, his expression calm and reassuring. For a moment, the tension in her chest eased. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice soft. Inside, the estate was a maze of grand ballrooms, each one more ostentatious than the last. Guests milled about, their laughter echoing through the high ceilings as waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Lila felt the weight of their gazes as she walked beside Noah, the whispers and glances a constant reminder that she didn't belong here. It wasn't long before Jonathan Blackwell approached them, his presence commanding as ever. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his tailored suit exuded authority. He greeted Noah with a firm handshake, his gaze lingering on Lila with thinly veiled scrutiny. "Lila," he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "It's good to see you again." "Mr. Blackwell," Lila replied, her tone polite but cool. Jonathan's eyes flicked to Noah. "She's settling in well, I trust?" "She is," Noah said, his tone steady. "Lila's been a great partner." Lila caught the faint edge in Jonathan's expression, as though he were searching for a crack in their performance. But before he could press further, a woman approached, her bright smile breaking the tension. "Jonathan, you promised me a dance," she said, linking her arm through his. Jonathan gave them both a curt nod before allowing himself to be led away, leaving Lila and Noah alone. "Well," Lila said under her breath, "that was fun." Noah chuckled, shaking his head. "He's always like that. Don't let it get to you." "Easier said than done," Lila muttered, taking a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. She sipped it slowly, scanning the room. "It's exhausting, you know, pretending to fit into a world that's nothing like your own." Noah's smile faded, his expression softening. "I know," he said quietly, "but you're stronger than you think, Lila. And you don't have to do this forever." She looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, the noise of the room seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them. The weight of their arrangement, of the secrets and unspoken truths between them, hung in the air. Before either of them could speak, a voice cut through the crowd. "Noah! There you are!" Sophia Harrington approached, her smile dazzling but her eyes sharp. She was dressed in a crimson gown that seemed designed to command attention, and as she reached them, her gaze flicked to Lila with thinly veiled disdain. "Lila," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness, "how lovely to see you again." "Likewise," Lila replied, her voice steady despite the tension simmering beneath the surface. Sophia turned her attention back to Noah, her smile widening. "You know, Noah, you're quite the topic of conversation tonight. Everyone's curious about your new arrangement." Noah's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Lila stepped forward. "Funny," Lila said, her tone cool but firm. "I didn't realize we were the entertainment. Should we start selling tickets?" Sophia blinked, caught off guard by the remark. Noah's lips twitched, and he placed a hand on Lila's back, gently guiding her away. As they moved through the crowd, Noah leaned close, his voice low and warm. "That was brilliant." Lila smirked, though her heart was still racing. "You're lucky I don't charge you for my wit." For the first time that night, she felt a flicker of confidence. Maybe, just maybe, she could survive this world after all. The ride back to the penthouse was steeped in silence. Lila leaned her head against the cool glass of the car window, her thoughts churning as the city lights flickered by. The evening had been a delicate balancing act, and while she'd managed to hold her own, the weight of it all lingered like an ache in her chest. Noah sat across from her, scrolling absently through his phone. She could feel his gaze flicker toward her occasionally, but he said nothing, giving her space. The tension between them was palpable, a mix of unspoken words and the growing complexity of their arrangement. When they finally arrived, Lila stepped out of the car and walked into the penthouse without waiting for Noah. The elevator ride up was quiet, the hum of the machinery filling the void. As the doors slid open, she slipped off her heels and tossed her clutch onto the nearest surface. "I need a drink," she muttered, heading for the kitchen. Noah followed, his footsteps measured, and leaned against the counter as she poured herself a glass of wine. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said after a moment. Lila raised an eyebrow as she sipped her wine. "That's the second time you've said that. Are you trying to convince me or yourself?" Noah's lips quirked into a faint smile. "You don't give yourself enough credit, Lila. Most people in that room wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes under Sophia's scrutiny." Lila set her glass down, her fingers tightening around the stem. "I'm not most people, Noah, and maybe that's the problem." Noah's expression softened and he stepped closer. "What do you mean?" She sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "This world of yours, it's exhausting. Pretending to fit in, playing a part. It's not who I am. And tonight, I realized something." "What's that?" "That no matter how hard I try, they'll never see me as anything more than an outsider. Someone who doesn't belong." Noah's brow furrowed and he reached out, placing a hand on hers. "You're wrong." "Am I?" Lila asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Even you have to admit it, Noah. You and I come from completely different worlds. This," she gestured around the penthouse, "this isn't real for me. It's just borrowed time." Noah's hand tightened on hers. "Lila, you're more real than anyone in that room tonight. They can't see past their own shallow ambitions, but you—" He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. "You're different. And that's why you belong, whether they realize it or not." Lila looked at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was raw honesty, an openness that made her chest tighten. "You're good at this, you know," she said finally, her voice tinged with dry humor, saying exactly what people want to hear. "It's not what you want to hear," Noah countered. "It's what I believe." The air between them grew heavy, the unspoken tension pressing against the walls of the room. Lila pulled her hand away, retreating a step. "I should get some sleep." "Lila, good night, Noah," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. She turned and walked away, leaving Noah standing alone in the kitchen, his hands shoved into his pockets. The following morning, Lila woke early, her mind still buzzing with the events of the previous night. She pulled on a pair of leggings and a hoodie and decided to take a walk. The crisp morning air was a welcome change from the stifling opulence of the penthouse, and as she wandered through the quiet streets, she felt a semblance of peace return. Her feet eventually led her to a familiar spot, a small park with a bench where she'd once spent countless nights sketching under the dim glow of streetlights. She sat down, pulling her sketchbook from her bag, and let the memories wash over her. For years this place had been her refuge, a space where she could escape the weight of the world. But now, as she looked around, it felt smaller somehow, as though it belonged to a different version of herself. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up to see Noah approaching, his coat unbuttoned, and his hands tucked into his pockets. "How did you find me?" she asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. "You're not that hard to figure out," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Plus, Elena mentioned you liked this park." Lila chuckled softly, shaking her head. Of course she did. Noah sat down beside her, his gaze sweeping over the park. "You come here often?" "I used to," Lila said, her voice quieter now. "Back when I didn't have anywhere else to go." Noah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It must have been hard." "It was," Lila admitted. But it was mine. It felt safe, in a way. They sat in silence for a moment, the morning light casting long shadows across the ground. Finally, Noah spoke. "I know you think this is just a temporary arrangement," he said, his voice steady. "And maybe it is. But that doesn't mean it has to be meaningless." Lila looked at him, her brow furrowing. "What are you saying, Noah?" "I'm saying that you've changed something for me," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "You've made me see my life differently, and I don't want to ignore that." Her breath caught, the sincerity in his voice sending a ripple through her chest. She looked away, her grip tightening on her sketchbook. "Noah, this isn't—" "I know it's complicated," he interrupted gently. "And I know we didn't plan for any of this. But I'm asking you to let me in, even just a little. Because I think we could be something more." The words hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Lila felt her defenses waver, the walls she'd built so carefully threatening to crumble. But fear lingered, the scars of her past holding her back. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. Noah reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Then let's figure it out together." For the first time in a long while, Lila felt the flicker of something she thought she'd lost: hope. And as she looked into Noah's eyes, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something real. The ride back to the penthouse after their park conversation felt different. Noah and Lila shared the space in silence, but the weight of his words lingered between them. "Let's figure it out together." Lila wasn't sure if it was a promise or a challenge, but either way, it terrified her. The familiar walls of the penthouse offered little comfort. Lila tossed her bag onto the couch and headed straight for the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water to calm her nerves. Noah followed her, his expression unreadable, and leaned against the counter. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "I don't know," Lila admitted, placing the glass down with more force than she intended. "This whole thing, it's complicated, Noah. And you asking me to let you in?" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I'm not sure I even know how to do that anymore." "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Noah said, his voice calm but earnest. "But I need you to know I'm not pretending anymore. Not about this." The honesty in his words sent a ripple through her, but Lila couldn't let herself sink into it. She had spent too many years fighting to keep her walls intact. Vulnerability wasn't something she could afford, not in a world like his, where people like Sophia Harrington were waiting for her to slip. "Why me, Noah?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Out of everyone in your world, why are you so determined to make this work?" He hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening as he searched for the right words. "Because you don't see me the way everyone else does. You're not impressed by the money or the name. You see me for who I am. And you're not afraid to call me out on my crap. I need that." Lila's chest tightened. It wasn't the answer she expected, but it was exactly what she needed to hear. Still, a part of her couldn't shake the fear of what letting him in would mean. For both of them. Later that evening, as Lila stood by the windows watching the city lights, the door to the penthouse buzzed. Noah answered it, and moments later Sophia Harrington's voice rang through the space. "Hello, Noah," Sophia said, her tone sugary sweet but edged with something sharper. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Lila turned, her stomach knotting as Sophia stepped inside, her crimson coat draped elegantly over her shoulders. Her piercing gaze swept over the penthouse before landing on Lila, her smile widening. "Lila?" she said, the name rolling off her tongue like a challenge. "Still getting used to all of this, I see." Lila forced a smile, though the tension in the room was almost suffocating. "It's a lot to take in." "I can imagine," Sophia said, her tone dripping with faux sympathy. Not everyone is cut out for this life. It takes a certain resilience. Noah's jaw tightened as he stepped between them. "What do you want, Sophia?" She turned to him, her smile softening. "I just came to talk. I've been hearing some interesting things, and I thought it would be better if we cleared the air." "Interesting things?" Lila asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping through her. Sophia's eyes gleamed. "Oh, you know how people love to talk. Questions about your background, your connection to Noah. It's all so fascinating." "That's enough," Noah said firmly. "Lila and I don't owe anyone an explanation, least of all you." Sophia arched an eyebrow, her smile unwavering. "I'm just looking out for you, Noah. You've worked so hard to build your reputation. I'd hate to see it tarnished by misunderstandings." Lila felt the sting of the remark, but she refused to let Sophia see it. She stepped forward, her voice calm but pointed. "If you have something to say, Sophia, just say it. Don't dance around it." Sophia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "You're bold. I'll give you that. But boldness can only get you so far in a world like this." "Good thing I'm not trying to fit into your world," Lila shot back. "I'm just trying to live my life." Sophia's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, Noah stepped in. "Sophia, we're done here." Sophia sighed, draping her coat over her arm. "Of course. I wouldn't want to overstay my welcome. But consider this a friendly warning, Noah. Not everyone will be as understanding as I am." With that, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The door closed behind her, leaving the room in tense silence. "Do people like her ever get tired of being so insufferable?" Lila asked, breaking the quiet. Noah let out a dry laugh, running a hand over his face. "She thrives on it. But you handled her well." "She's not wrong, though," Lila said, her voice quieter now. "People are going to keep asking questions. And the more they dig, the harder this gets for both of us." Noah crossed the room and stood in front of her, his gaze steady. "Then let them dig. I don't care what they think, Lila. This isn't about them." "But it's your world, Noah," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You've built everything on your reputation, and I don't want to be the reason it all falls apart." "You're not," he said firmly, "and you never will be." The conviction in his voice sent a wave of warmth through her, but it didn't erase the fear lingering in the back of her mind. She wanted to believe him, to trust that they could navigate this together. But the world around them felt too close, its edges pressing in with every step they took. Noah reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together." For the first time that night, Lila allowed herself to believe him, even if only for a moment. The road ahead was uncertain, but for now, she wasn't walking it alone. Lila had learned to carry herself with confidence over the past few weeks, a necessary armor in a world where every glance felt like a judgment. But after Sophia's visit, cracks had begun to form in her resolve. The words had been thinly veiled, but the meaning was clear. She didn't belong here, and she never would. She tried to push it from her mind, telling herself she didn't care what people like Sophia thought. But the tension lingered, coiling tighter with each passing day. Even Noah's assurances couldn't completely silence the doubt that echoed in her mind. The days passed in a blur, the routine of their arrangement offering some semblance of normalcy. Noah had become busier, his work demanding long hours in meetings and negotiations. Lila found herself alone in the penthouse more often, filling the quiet with her sketches and long walks through the city. One afternoon, as she wandered through the park, she saw a familiar face. Marie, a woman she had known during her time at the shelter. She hesitated for a moment, then approached, her heart racing with both excitement and unease. "Marie?" she called softly. The older woman turned, her face lighting up with recognition. "Lila! Oh my goodness, look at you!" Lila smiled, but the warmth in Marie's voice brought a lump to her throat. "It's been a while." Marie's eyes swept over her, taking in the sleek coat and polished boots that now adorned her. "You've done well for yourself," she said, her tone gentle but curious. "What's happened since I last saw you?" Lila hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It's complicated," she said finally. "I'm in a better place now, but it's not exactly what it looks like." Marie studied her for a moment, her brow furrowing. "Are you happy?" The question caught Lila off guard. Happiness had always felt like a luxury, something distant and unattainable. "I don't know," she admitted. "Things are better, but it's complicated." Marie nodded, her expression softening. Sometimes, better is enough to start with. They talked for a while longer, reminiscing about their time at the shelter and catching up on what had changed. When they parted ways, Lila felt a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude for seeing Marie again, but also a sense of loss for the simpler, if harder, life she had left behind. That evening Noah returned home late, his tie loosened and exhaustion etched into his face. He found Lila sitting on the couch, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. She looked up as he entered, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Long day?" she asked. "Too long," Noah said, dropping onto the couch beside her. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes. "You'd think running your own company would mean less red tape, but it's the opposite." Lila chuckled softly. "Welcome to the world you built." He cracked one eye open, his lips curving into a small smile. "Funny." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of the day slowly lifting. But Lila's conversation with Marie lingered in her mind, and she couldn't shake the urge to ask the question that had been nagging at her. "Noah," she said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" He straightened, his expression softening. "Of course." "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice quiet. "With all of this? With your life?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he considered his answer. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've spent so much time chasing success, trying to live up to my father's expectations, that I'm not sure I even know what happiness looks like anymore." Lila nodded, her chest tightening at the vulnerability in his voice. "That's honest." He glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "What about you?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I think I've spent so long surviving that I never really thought about what it means to be happy. But I know this isn't it. Not completely." Noah reached out, covering her hand with his. "Then let's figure it out together." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Lila couldn't ignore. She wanted to believe him, to trust that they could find something real amidst the chaos of their arrangement. But fear lingered, a constant reminder of everything she stood to lose. The tension between them came to a head 2 nights later. They were at another event, a sleek charity auction filled with the usual crowd of elites. Lila had grown adept at navigating these spaces, but tonight, something felt off. As the evening wore on, she found herself face to face with a journalist, a man whose questions carried a sharp edge. "Lila Rose, isn't it?" he asked, his smile polite but calculating. "You've certainly made quite the impression since entering Mr. Blackwell's life." "I try," Lila said, keeping her tone light. He tilted his head, his gaze uncomfortably direct. "Your background is, interesting. Not much on record about you before your relationship with Noah. Care to share your story?" Lila's chest tightened, but she forced a smile. My story isn't nearly as interesting as people think. The journalist's smile didn't falter. Modesty is admirable, but people love a good origin story. And yours seems particularly unique. Noah appeared at her side before she could respond, his expression calm but his presence unmistakably protective. "If you'll excuse us," he said smoothly, guiding Lila away. When they were out of earshot, Lila let out a shaky breath. "That was too close." Noah's jaw tightened. "They're vultures, Lila. They'll dig for anything they can use to sell a story." Her eyes met his, fear flickering in their depths. "What happens if they find something?" "Then we deal with it," Noah said firmly. "Together." But as they left the event, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the walls around them were closing in. The world they had built was beginning to crack, and she wasn't sure how much longer they could hold it together. The ride back from the charity auction was thick with silence, a tension simmering just beneath the surface. Lila stared out the window, her fingers gripping the edge of her clutch like it was a lifeline. The journalist's words replayed in her mind, each one feeling like a thread unraveling the fragile web she and Noah had spun around their lives. Next to her, Noah sat rigid, his jaw clenched. She could sense his frustration, though it wasn't directed at her. It wasn't fair that their arrangement, a means to protect his freedom and her stability, felt increasingly like a trap. And yet, here they were. When the car pulled up to the penthouse, Lila stepped out without waiting for Noah, her heels clicking against the pavement as she headed inside. He followed, the tension between them unspoken but palpable. As soon as they entered the living room, she turned to face him. "This isn't working," she said, her voice tight. Noah frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean this whole thing," Lila said, gesturing around her. "The pretending, the events, the people digging into my past, it's too much." "Lila, we knew this wouldn't be easy," Noah said, stepping closer. "But we've handled everything so far. We can handle this too." She shook her head, her chest tightening. "You don't get it, Noah. They're not just asking questions, they're looking for cracks, and if they find out where I came from, what I've been through—" "They won't," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I won't let them." His confidence was unwavering, but it did little to ease the fear gnawing at her. "You can't control everything, Noah. This isn't just about you or your father or your company. This is my life they're picking apart. And I'm trying to protect you," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Do you think I don't see what this is doing to you? To us?" The words hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. Lila's breath caught, the vulnerability in his voice slicing through her defenses. She took a step back, her arms wrapping around herself as if to shield against the emotions threatening to spill over. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. Noah ran a hand through his hair, his frustration giving way to something softer. "Neither did I. But that doesn't mean we can't find a way to make it work." "Maybe we can't," Lila said, her voice trembling. "Maybe this was doomed from the start." Noah stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "Do you really believe that?" She hesitated, her heart twisting painfully. "I don't know." The days that followed were strained, the once comfortable rhythm of their lives disrupted by unspoken doubts and fears. Lila withdrew, spending more time in her room or wandering the city. Noah buried himself in work, his days consumed by meetings and phone calls, though his thoughts remained anchored to her. It wasn't until the weekend that the tension finally broke. Lila was in the kitchen, making tea, when Noah walked in. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, but his expression was determined. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but gentle. Lila set her mug down, bracing herself. "About what?" "About us," Noah said, "about where this is going." She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "What's there to talk about? This was never supposed to be real." "But it is," he said, his gaze locking onto hers. It became real the moment we stopped seeing this as a deal and started caring about each other. Lila's breath hitched, the truth in his words hitting her like a wave. She looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. That doesn't mean it's enough. Why not? Noah asked, stepping closer. Because of what people think? Because of where you came from? None of that matters to me, Lila. It matters to them, she said, her voice rising, and they'll never let me forget it. Then let them talk, he said, his voice growing more passionate. Let them dig and judge and say whatever they want. It won't change how I feel about you. Lila froze, her heart pounding in her chest. How you feel about me? Noah took her hands in his gaze steady and unwavering. I'm in love with you, Lila, and I'm not going to let anything, or anyone, get in the way of that. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, her emotions a chaotic swirl of hope and fear. Noah, you can't just— Yes, I can, he interrupted, his voice firm but tender. You've shown me what it means to be real, to fight for something that matters. And I'm not giving up on us, no matter how hard it gets. The sincerity in his voice broke through her defenses, and for the first time in weeks, Lila let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. She took a shaky breath, her fingers curling around his. I'm scared, Noah, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared of losing myself in all of this. You won't, he said, his grip tightening. You're stronger than you think, Lila. And no matter what happens, I'll be right here with you. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people finding their way back to each other, their connection stronger for having been tested. Finally, Lila nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking through the fear. Okay, she said softly. Let's figure it out. Noah smiled, his relief evident. Together. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lila felt a flicker of hope. Not just for their arrangement, but for the possibility of something real. And as Noah pulled her into a warm embrace, she realized that maybe, just maybe, love was worth the risk. The tentative peace between Noah and Lila lasted only a few days before reality came crashing back. Their newfound connection felt fragile, held together by hope and promises, but the cracks around them grew wider. It started with a phone call. Noah was in his office when his assistant Elena walked in, her usual calm replaced with visible unease. Noah, we have a problem. He looked up, his brow furrowing. What kind of problem? Elena handed him a tablet, the screen lit with a headline that made his stomach drop. Lila rose. From the streets to the penthouse, the untold story of Noah Blackwell's fiancée. Noah's jaw tightened as he skimmed the article. It was a scathing exposé, detailing everything from Lila's time at the shelter to the gaps in her personal history. While much of it was speculation, the tone was clear. She was an opportunist who had charmed her way into his life. The final blow came with a quote from Sophia Harrington, who had clearly fed the story. I only want what's best for Noah, Sophia had said, but it's important to ask questions about the people we let into our lives, especially when they come from unconventional backgrounds. Noah slammed the tablet onto the desk, his anger boiling. Sophia, he muttered under his breath. Elena watched him carefully. What do you want to do? Get our PR team on this, he said sharply. I want them to shut this down before it spirals. Elena hesitated. And Lila? She's going to see this. Noah's chest tightened. He knew how much this would hurt her, how much it would feed the insecurities she tried so hard to hide. I'll talk to her, he said. Just make sure this doesn't get any worse. When Noah walked into the penthouse later that afternoon, the tension in the air was palpable. Lila was sitting on the couch, her laptop open in front of her, her face pale as she stared at the screen. She didn't look up when he entered. "So it's true," she said, her voice hollow. "They're digging into my past." Noah crossed the room, his heart sinking at the look on her face. "Lila, I'm so sorry. I didn't know they'd go this far." She closed the laptop with trembling hands, standing to face him. "Didn't you? This was always a risk, wasn't it? Putting me in the spotlight like this, pretending I belonged in your world?" "You do belong," Noah said, his voice firm. "This isn't about you, Lila. It's about people like Sophia, people who can't stand the idea of me being with someone real." Lila let out a bitter laugh. "Real? Do you know what it's like to have your worst moments plastered across headlines for the world to judge? To have people like Sophia call you a charity case?" "You're not a charity case," Noah said, stepping closer, "and I don't care what anyone else thinks." "Well, I do," she snapped, her voice breaking. "Because they're not just attacking me, Noah. They're tearing apart everything I've tried to rebuild." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He reached for her, but she pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself, as if to hold the pieces together. "Lila," he said softly, his voice tinged with desperation. "Please don't shut me out. We can get through this." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know if I can, Noah. I'm so tired of fighting, of trying to prove that I'm more than the worst thing that ever happened to me." "You don't have to prove anything," he said, his voice cracking. "Not to me. Not to anyone." She looked at him then, her expression a mixture of longing and heartbreak. "That's easy for you to say. You've never had to live like this." The words stung, but Noah didn't argue. She was right. He couldn't fully understand what she had endured, the weight of a life spent surviving instead of living. All he could do was try to stand beside her, even when she felt like the world was against her. The following morning, Lila was gone. Noah woke to find her room empty, her clothes and belongings missing. A note lay on the kitchen counter, written in her familiar scrawl. "Noah, I need some time to figure out who I am outside of all of this. Please don't try to find me. I'll be okay. Thank you for everything. Lila." He stared at the note, his chest tightening with a mix of heartbreak and frustration. He wanted to chase after her, to tell her they could weather this storm together. But he knew Lila too well to ignore her request. She needed space, and as much as it killed him, he had to respect that. For the next few days, Noah threw himself into his work, using the distraction to dull the ache of her absence. But no amount of meetings or phone calls could fill the void she had left. The penthouse felt empty, its once lively energy replaced by a hollow silence. Elena noticed the change in him, though she didn't press. One afternoon she walked into his office with a hesitant expression. "There's something you should see," she said, handing him her tablet. Noah's heart sank as he saw the headline, "Lila Rose Speaks Out, the Truth Behind the Headlines." It wasn't a tabloid piece. It was a personal essay, published on a respected platform, written by Lila herself. In it she told her story, her struggles, her resilience, and her refusal to let her past define her. She didn't mention Noah directly, but her words carried a strength that left no doubt. She was reclaiming her narrative. As Noah read, a sense of pride swelled in his chest. Lila had faced the storm head-on, refusing to let anyone else control her story. But as much as he admired her courage, it didn't ease the ache of missing her. When he reached the final paragraph, his breath caught. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't surviving. It's letting yourself believe you deserve more." I'm still learning how to do that, but for the first time I think I'm ready to try." Noah closed the tablet, his resolve hardening. He couldn't force Lila to come back, but he could show her that he was willing to fight for her, just as she had fought for herself. And maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance to figure it out, together. Noah sat in the penthouse, the city stretching out before him like an endless sea of lights. Lila's essay had been open on his laptop for hours. The words burned into his mind. Each line revealed pieces of her he had only glimpsed before: her strength, her vulnerability, and her quiet defiance against a world that had tried to break her. She was extraordinary, and she was gone. For days he had respected her request for space, but the more he thought about her, the more he realized that space wasn't what she needed. Lila didn't need to be saved. She needed to know she wasn't alone. With that thought, Noah grabbed his coat and headed for the door. He found her in the most fitting place possible, a quiet art gallery tucked away in one of the city's less flashy neighborhoods. The exhibit featured emerging artists, and though Noah hadn't been sure she would be here, something in his gut told him this was where he would find her. When he stepped inside, the faint scent of paint and sawdust greeted him. The space was small but warm, with exposed brick walls and soft lighting that illuminated the artwork. And there, in the far corner, was Lila. She stood in front of a large canvas, her back to him, her auburn hair pulled into a loose bun. The painting before her was breathtaking, a swirling blend of colors that seemed to pulse with emotion. It was raw and beautiful, just like her. Noah hesitated, unsure if he should interrupt. But as if sensing his presence, Lila turned. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You found me," she said softly, her voice a mixture of surprise and resignation. Noah stepped closer, his hands in his pockets. "You didn't make it easy." A faint smile tugged at her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What are you doing here, Noah?" "I could ask you the same thing," he said, glancing at the painting. "But I think the answer is obvious." Lila's gaze followed his, her shoulders stiffening. "It's nothing, just something I've been working on." "It's not nothing," Noah said, his voice firm but gentle. "It's incredible. And so are you." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "You always know the right thing to say, don't you?" "It's not about saying the right thing," Noah said, stepping closer. "It's about meaning it, and I do." Lila looked at him then, her green eyes searching his face. "Why are you here, Noah?" "Really?" He took a deep breath, his chest tightening. "Because I made a promise, to you and to myself, that I wouldn't give up on us, and I'm not going to." Lila turned away, her arms wrapping around herself. "You don't understand, Noah. This world of yours, it's not just overwhelming, it's suffocating. And I don't know if I can be a part of it without losing myself." "You don't have to lose yourself," Noah said, his voice steady. "I don't want you to. I want you to be exactly who you are, Lila. That's the person I fell in love with." Her breath caught, and she turned to face him, her expression wavering between hope and fear. "You say that now, but what happens when the next scandal hits? When the next person decides to dig into my past?" "Then we face it together," Noah said, closing the distance between them. "I can't promise it will be easy, but I can promise you this. You won't have to face it alone." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, her jaw tightening. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he admitted, "but nothing worth having ever is." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The distant hum of the gallery faded, leaving only the two of them, their breaths mingling in the quiet space between words. Finally, Lila spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose myself, Noah, But I don't want to lose you either." "You won't," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You don't have to choose. We can figure this out together, on our terms, not anyone else's." Her lips trembled and she let out a shaky laugh. "You're stubborn, you know that?" "I've been told," Noah said, a small smile breaking through his seriousness. "But it's only because you're worth it." Lila stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," Noah said, his grip tightening around hers. "But so am I. And that's okay." The vulnerability in his voice broke through the last of her defenses, and she stepped closer, resting her head against his chest. Noah wrapped his arms around her, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. They stayed like that for a long time, the weight of their fears and doubts melting away in the warmth of their embrace. For the first time in weeks, Lila felt a sense of calm settle over her, a quiet certainty that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Because sometimes, love wasn't about having all the answers. It was about choosing to face the questions, together. The weeks following Noah's unexpected visit to the gallery marked a subtle but profound shift in their dynamic. They no longer danced around the tension of their relationship or the weight of their respective worlds. Instead, they faced it head-on, acknowledging the challenges while trying to carve out a space that was wholly theirs. Lila returned to the penthouse, but this time, it felt different. She wasn't there as a reluctant participant in a staged arrangement, but as someone who was beginning to believe she belonged, not because of Noah's world, but because of the bond they had built. One afternoon, Lila sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by her sketches. She was working on a piece for an upcoming gallery exhibit that Marie had encouraged her to join. It was a simple charity event for emerging artists, but for Lila, it felt monumental. Noah walked in, fresh from a morning of meetings, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of her surrounded by her work. A soft smile curved his lips. "You've been busy," he said, stepping closer. Lila glanced up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Deadlines will do that to you." He crouched beside her, picking up one of the sketches, a delicate rendering of two hands clasped together, their fingers intertwined. "This one's incredible," he said, his voice full of admiration. "It's not finished," she said, though her cheeks flushed at the compliment. "It doesn't need to be," Noah said, setting it down carefully. "You have a way of capturing so much emotion in your work. It's raw, honest." Lila smiled, a flicker of warmth spreading through her chest. "Coming from you, that means a lot." He leaned back, resting his arms on his knees. "I was thinking, after the exhibit, why not take some time for yourself? Go somewhere quiet. Recharge." She tilted her head, studying him. "You mean, run away from all the chaos?" "Not run away," he said quickly. "Just step back. Sometimes it helps to get perspective." "And what about you?" she asked. "You're not exactly the step-back type." Noah hesitated, his smile fading slightly. "I've been thinking about that, about what it would mean to slow down, to focus on something more than work." "Something?" Lila asked, her voice softening. "Someone," he corrected, meeting her gaze. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Lila's heart raced, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "That's a big change for you." "It is," he admitted. "But you've already changed so much for me, Lila. I want this, us, to be more than just surviving. I want us to build something real." She looked away, her fingers brushing over the edge of her sketchbook. "It's not easy, Noah. Balancing our worlds, being together." "I know," he said, his voice steady, "but I think it's worth it." Later that evening, they attended a small dinner hosted by one of Noah's business partners. It wasn't the flashy gala-style event Lila had come to dread, but an intimate gathering of a few key players in the company. Still, Lila felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest as they arrived. Noah stayed close to her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back as they navigated the room. He introduced her with genuine warmth, and while there were still a few curious glances and murmurs, Lila found herself feeling less like an outsider. At one point, as the evening wound down, one of the guests, a woman named Evelyn, pulled Lila aside. She was older, with sharp eyes and a warm smile, and she studied Lila with a mix of curiosity and approval. "You've made quite the impression tonight," Evelyn said, her tone kind. Lila smiled nervously. "I'm not sure that's true." "Oh, it is," Evelyn said. "You're different from most people in this circle. It's refreshing." Lila hesitated, unsure how to respond. Different isn't always a good thing. "Sometimes it's the best thing," Evelyn said, her smile widening. "Don't lose that." The words stayed with Lila as they left the dinner. She replayed them in her mind, her heart tugging between the lingering doubts and the hope that she could truly belong, not in Noah's world, but in his life. Back at the penthouse, Lila curled up on the couch, her thoughts swirling. Noah joined her, settling into the seat beside her and draping an arm over the back of the couch. "Evelyn seemed impressed with you," he said, his tone teasing. "She's kind," Lila said, her voice thoughtful. "She said I was different." "You are," Noah said, his gaze warm. "That's what makes you incredible." Lila let out a soft laugh, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You're biased." "Completely," he said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "But I'm also right." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the city lights casting a soft glow over the room. Lila felt the weight of the evening begin to lift, replaced by the quiet certainty that, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. "Noah," she said after a moment, her voice quiet. "I'm scared." He tilted his head, looking down at her. "Of what?" "Of failing," she admitted. "Of letting you down. Of not being enough." "You're more than enough," he said firmly, his voice steady. "And if you fail, we fail together. That's what this is about, Lila. Building something strong enough to withstand the cracks." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "You really believe that?" "I do," he said, his voice unwavering. "And I'll keep believing it for both of us, if that's what it takes." Lila smiled, a soft, hopeful expression that lit up her face. "Then let's build something worth believing in." Noah pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her as the world outside faded into the background. Together they had faced the worst of their fears. Now they were ready to face the future, hand in hand, one step at a time. The gallery buzzed with soft murmurs and quiet footsteps, the air humming with anticipation. Lila stood at the edge of the room, her fingers gripping a champagne flute as she watched guests filter in. It was the opening night of her exhibit, a showcase of pieces inspired by her life, her struggles, and the unlikely journey that had brought her here. She had debated for days whether to include the centerpiece, a painting titled The Crossing, depicting two figures on either side of a fractured bridge, their hands reaching for one another across the gap. It was deeply personal, raw, and vulnerable. But Marie had convinced her it was time to let the world see her truth, and the world had responded. The room was full of people, not just art enthusiasts, but friends she had made along the way. Marie stood near the corner, beaming with pride, while Noah lingered by the entrance, a quiet but steady presence that anchored her even now. The months leading up to this moment had been a whirlwind. After their reconciliation, Lila and Noah had worked to rebuild their lives together, piece by piece. Their relationship had grown stronger, not because they ignored their differences, but because they faced them head-on. They learned to blend their worlds, finding a balance that allowed them to be themselves while embracing the life they were building together. Noah had surprised her one day by stepping back from Blackwell Enterprises, shifting his focus to projects that aligned with his values. He poured his energy into a foundation aimed at empowering underserved communities, a choice inspired in part by Lila's resilience and the stories she had shared about her time on the streets. For Lila, the gallery was more than an opportunity to share her art. It was a declaration of who she was and who she wanted to be. She no longer felt like an outsider in Noah's world. Instead, she had created a space of her own, a space where her voice, her past, and her dreams mattered. As the night went on, Lila found herself swept up in conversations with guests. People praised her work, asked about her process, and expressed admiration for the emotions her pieces evoked. But it wasn't until the room began to empty that she finally allowed herself to breathe. She turned, searching for Noah, and found him standing in front of the crossing. He was studying it intently, his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. "What do you think?" she asked, joining him. He looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think it's perfect." She tilted her head, watching him. "Really? Because I wasn't sure about including it." "I'm glad you did," Noah said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's us." Lila's breath caught. "What do you mean?" He gestured to the painting, his gaze returning to it. "The bridge, the gap, the hands reaching for each other. It's what we've been doing this whole time, reaching, even when it felt impossible." She followed his gaze, her chest tightening as the meaning behind the piece settled over her. "Do you think we've crossed it?" she asked softly. Noah turned to her, his expression serious but full of warmth. "I think we've built something stronger than the bridge. Something that can't be broken." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, a small laugh escaping her. "You always know what to say." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Not always. But when it comes to you, I just say what I feel." He reached into his pocket then, pulling out a small velvet box. Lila's breath hitched as he opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring, the diamond catching the light. "I don't want to just reach anymore," Noah said, his voice steady and sure. "I want to stand with you, build a life with you, not because of an arrangement or expectations, but because I love you, Lila, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." Lila stared at him, her heart pounding. The room around them seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in the glow of the gallery lights. "Noah," she began, her voice trembling. "Are you sure about this? About us?" "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. "You've changed me, Lila. You've shown me what it means to live, to love, and to fight for something real. And I can't imagine doing any of it without you." Tears spilled over, and Lila laughed through them, shaking her head. "You're impossible, you know that?" He grinned. "I've been told." She looked at the ring, then back at him, her heart swelling with a mix of love and hope. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Noah." His smile widened, and he slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into a warm embrace. The applause that erupted from the remaining guests caught them off guard, and they both laughed, turning to see Marie leading the small crowd in cheers. As the celebration swirled around them, Lila felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had found her place, not in Noah's world, but in the life they had created together. And for the first time, she believed that their love was strong enough to bridge any gap, no matter how wide. That night, as they walked hand in hand through the quiet city streets, Lila glanced at Noah, her heart full. "Do you think it's possible?" she asked. "What's that?" he replied, his thumb brushing over her hand. "To have it all," she said. "Love, happiness, purpose, everything we've been fighting for." Noah stopped, turning to face her. "I don't think it's about having it all," he said. "I think it's about having enough, and knowing that together we can make it more." Lila smiled, leaning into him. "Then I think we're going to be just fine." And as they continued down the path, the city lights guiding their way, Lila knew that she had finally found not just a home, but a life worth fighting for. A life filled with love, resilience, and the quiet certainty that together they could face anything.